When we think about religious law, it's easy to picture this single, unchanging, rigid set of rules, right? But with Muslim law, that's not really the case. It's actually more like a huge, sprawling river, fed by all these different streams of thought over, like, 1,400 years. So today, we're going to dive into how this one faith ended up with so many different legal traditions. And that's really the central question, isn't it? How can a text, a divine revelation from the 7th century, possibly guide life in our world today, the 21st century? Well, the answer isn't simple, and it's definitely not one size fits all. The key is found in this incredible, dynamic system of legal thought that grew specifically to bridge that massive gap in time. So, it all started with a huge challenge. Right after the Prophet Muhammad passed away, the community was faced with all sorts of new situations. And the thing is, the holy books, the Quran and the Prophet's teachings, the Hadith, they just didn't have explicit answers for everything. There were gaps, a kind of silence. And that silence, it forced scholars to step in and interpret. Naturally, they didn't all interpret things the same way. And that is basically the origin story for all the different schools of law in Islam. All right, so let's start right there with the whole idea of interpretation. Because in Islam, this isn't just a casual thing. It's a seriously sophisticated field of study. Okay, so this is the core concept you've got to get. There's Sharia, which is seen as the divine law. Think of it like the perfect, unchanging blueprint from God. But then there's the human effort to understand and apply that blueprint to real life. That part is called Islamic jurisprudence, or fiqh. I love this analogy. If Sharia is the divine blueprint, then all the different legal schools are like competing architecture firms. They're all working from the exact same blueprint, but they each have their own unique methods and styles for how to build the actual building. Now, before we meet those different architectural teams, we have to talk about the first and biggest split in the entire community. This division is absolutely foundational. You really can't understand the different legal traditions without getting this first. So when you look at the global Muslim population today, the vast majority, we're talking about 90%, are Sunni. The other 10% or so are Shia. And this split, it happened right at the very beginning of Islamic history. It all kicked off because of a huge disagreement over a question that was both political and theological. And here's what it all boiled down to. After the Prophet died, who should lead the community? It's a huge question, right? Well, the Sunni community believed the leader, the caliph, should be elected, chosen from among the most qualified people. But the Shia community believed leadership wasn't something you vote on. They saw it as a divine right that had to be passed down through the Prophet's own family, specifically to his cousin and son-in-law, Ali. Just that one single disagreement about who should be in charge created two completely distinct paths that would eventually develop their own unique legal traditions. Okay, so let's zoom in on the Sunni world first and see how this all played out. Within that 90%, 4 major schools of legal thought eventually rose to prominence. And what's super important to remember is that they all accept the exact same core holy texts. The difference between them is all about how they go about interpreting those texts. First up, you've got the Hanafi School. This one's the most widespread of all of them. It's generally seen as the most liberal or adaptable, and that's mainly because it puts a big emphasis on using logical reasoning and analogy to figure out answers for modern problems that, just aren't in the ancient texts. This is the school you'll find most followed in places like India, Pakistan, and Turkey. Just think, H for Hanafi, head of India. Then there's the Maliki school, which takes a much more traditionalist approach. For them, what's super important are the actual customs and practices of the people who lived in Medina. That's the Prophet's own city. The thinking goes, hey, those people's way of life must be the closest thing we have to a living example of the Prophet's teachings. You'll see the school practiced all across North Africa. A good way to remember it. Maliki, Medina memories. So you've got reason on one side and tradition on the other. Enter Imam al-Shafi, who basically forged a brilliant middle path. His school, the Shafi school, strikes a balance between the Hanafi focus on logic and the Maliki focus on tradition. But his biggest contribution, the thing he's really famous for, was creating a clear systematic methodology, a kind of step-by-step guide to the sources of law. And that system is still foundational to Islamic law today. Think, Shafi equals systematic scholar. And finally, rounding out the 4 Sunni schools, we have the Hanbali school. This one is the most conservative of the bunch. It really insists on a strict, literal reading of the Quran and the Hadith. There's way less emphasis here on human reasoning or local customs. It's all about what the text says, period. And this is the official school of law in Saudi Arabia. Just remember, Hanbali, hardline literalist. Okay, so let's do a super quick recap of the Sunni schools. Hanafi, that's the liberal, reason-based one. Maliki, the traditional, custom-based one. Shafi'i, the systematic balance between them. And Hanbali, the strict literalist one. 4 schools, 4 really distinct approaches to the law. All right, so that's the Sunni side. Now let's hop over the divide and take a look at the major schools within this Shia tradition. And remember, the whole foundation here is that core belief in leadership coming directly from the Prophet's family. So within Shia Islam, 3 main schools really stand out. First, and by far the biggest, is the Ithna Ashari school, also known as the Twelvers. This is the dominant school in Iran, and they believe in a line of 12 infallible leaders, or imams, who succeeded the Prophet. Then you have the Ismailis. You might know them as Khojas or Bohras, especially in India, and they follow a slightly different line of succession. And finally, there are the Zaidis, who are found mostly in Yemen. What's interesting about them is that their legal principles are often seen as being the closest to the Sunni schools. Okay, so we've met the different schools are architects, right? But what tools are they actually using to build their legal systems? What's in their toolkit? This is where we get into the sources of Muslim law, the actual building materials. It basically breaks down into 2 main categories. First, you have the primary sources. These are considered divine. We're talking the direct word of God and the examples set by the Prophet. Then you have the secondary sources. These are the human-derived tools, things like logic, legal reasoning, and interpretation that scholars developed over time to apply those divine sources to new problems. And there's a very strict hierarchy here, a clear order of operations. Think of it like a checklist. Step 1, scholars always go to the Quran first, the direct word of God. Step 2, if the Quran is silent, they look to the Hadith or Sunnah, which is the Prophet's example. Only if both of those primary sources don't give a clear answer do they move on to the human-derived tools. The first of those is ijma, which is the consensus of scholars who have looked at this before. And if there's still no answer, they finally turn to qiyas, which is using analogy and reasoning to come up with a ruling. So here's a perfect example of a primary source in action. This verse from the Quran about inheritance law is crystal clear. It's direct, it's explicit. This isn't something that's really open for interpretation. It's a direct command. And so it forms the absolute foundation for how inheritance works in Islamic law. But okay, what about things the Quran obviously never mentions? You know, stuff like cryptocurrency or modern medical procedures like surrogacy. That's exactly where those secondary, human-derived sources become so crucial. Things like local customs, rulings from past court cases, laws passed by modern governments, and even just broad principles of fairness. They all come into play to help the law adapt and stay relevant in a changing world. So we've got all these different schools and this whole toolkit of sources. The big question is, how does it all fit together? I think the best way to wrap your head around it is to go back to that architect analogy. You have all these different architects, the schools of law, and yeah, they might build very different looking buildings, but they are all, without exception, drawing from the exact same box of building materials, the Quran, the Hadith, and that shared toolkit of legal reasoning. And really, that is the key takeaway here. Despite all their differences in methodology and interpretation, every single one of these schools is united by one single goal, and that is to figure out how to apply divine guidance to the messy, complicated reality of everyday human life. So in the end, we're kind of back where we started. We have this incredibly intricate legal system built on 2 pillars, divine revelation and human reason. The big question, looking to the future, is how this dynamic relationship between the 2 will continue to evolve, how it will adapt, and how it will answer the challenges of a world that its founders could never, ever have imagined.